დღევანდელი შეხვედრის თემა რეალურად ეხება ყველა ჩვენგანს ერთის მხრივ აკადემიური სივრცის წარმომადგენლებს, მეორეს მხრივ იმ ადამიანებს, ვისაც ჰქონდათ ადმინისტრაციული გამოცდილება და განათლების სისტემაში ადმინისტრაციული თუ არასამთავრობო, საერთაშორისო თუ ქართული არასამთავრობო სექტორიდან მონაწილეობდნენ და რა თქმა უნდა ეს თემა, ეს დისკუსია ეხება ჩვენ სტუდენტებს, რომლებიც ჩვენი განათლების სისტემის მთავარი ბენეფიციარები არიან და ცხადია ყოველთვის მათთვის კეთდება ყველა მნიშვნელოვანი საქმე, რაც ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტში თუ ზოგადად საქართველოს განათლების სისტემაში არის დაგეგმილი. ჩვენი დღევანდელი ღონისძიება, ორდღიანი ღონისძიება, უпростоრად ვორქშოპი ტარდება კენტის უნივერსიტეტის მხარდაჭერით და რეალურად ეს არის კენტის უნივერსიტეტის პროექტი. სწორედ ამიტომ ჩვენთან ემყოფება პროფესორი დავით აიერსი კენტის უნივერსიტეტიდან. ის არის მოდერნიზმის და კრიტიკული თეორიის პროფესორი, თუმცა ამ შემთხვევაში ჩვენ საუბრობთ განათლების საკითხებზე. შესაძლოა თქვენ გაგიკვირდეთ კიდეც, რატომ საუბრობთ განათლების საკითხებზე, ჰუმანიტარული და სოციალური დისციპლინების წარმომადგენლები, მაგრამ ამ ვორქშოპის და ზოგადად ამ სამომავლო თანამშრომლობის იდეა სწორედ ეს იქნება, რომ განათლებაში მიმდინარე პროცესები, საუნივერსიტეტო სივრცეში მიმდინარე ცვლილებები შეფასდეს იმ თვალსაზრისით, თუ რამდენად მნიშვნელოვანი გავლენის მოხდენა შეუძლიათ ამ ცვლილებებს საზოგადოებაზე. მთავარი კონცეფტი, მთავარი ტერმინი, რომლის ფარგლებშიც ჩვენ ახლა ვსაუბრობთ, ეს არის განათლების სისტემის მდგრადობა, სტაბილურობა ან ადაპტაციის უნარი. ანუ ინგლისურად ეს ტერმინი დღეს ჟღერს როგორც resilience, ეს არ არის ზუსტად იგივე მნიშვნელობის, რაც არის sustainability, რომელიც მსოფლიოში დღეს პოლიტიკური თუ სოციალური მიმართულების პროექტების ერთ-ერთი მთავარი კონცეფტია, მაგრამ resilience, ანუ როგორადაც ეს ტერმინი ამ ეტაპზე ჩვენ თარგმნეთ, შეიძლება იყოს სტაბილურობა, მაგრამ მეორე მხრივ მე აი გუშინდელი და დღევანდელი დისკუსიების საფუძველზე ვიტყოდი, რომ ეს შეიძლება უფრო იყოს ადაპტაბელურობა. არც მთლად ქართულში ჯერ ეს ლამაზად არ ჟღერს და მიჩვეულები არა ვართ, მაგრამ იმედია, რომ რაღაცნაირად შესაფერის იდეას მოვძებნით, რომ როგორი უნდა იყოს ის საზოგადოება, რომელსაც აქვს ახალი ამოცანები, ახალი გამოწვევები, ადაპტაცია მოახდინოს გარემო ვითარებასთან და შექმნილ პოლიტიკურ, კულტურულ ცვლილებებთან. სინამდვილეში ნამდვილად შეგვიძლია ვთქვათ, რომ ქართულ საზოგადოებას 90-იანი წლების დასაწყისში, როდესაც შეიცვალა ერთი ფორმაცია და დაიწყო ახალი, როდესაც დაინგრა იქ სახელმწიფო, რომელშიც ცხოვრობდით საბედნიეროდ, მე ვიტყოდი, რომ განსხვავებით იმ სახელმწიფოს ლიდერისგან, რომელსაც მიაჩნია, რომ ეს არის ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე დიდი გეოპოლიტიკური კატასტროფა თანამედროვე სამყაროში, ჩვენ ბედნიერები ვართ ამ ცვლილებებით, მაგრამ საქართველოს ვიცით, რომ ამ ცვლილებებთან ადაპტირება გაუჭირდა. და ჩვენ ისიც ვიცით, რომ მაშინ, როდესაც ჩვენმა ქვეყანამ მიზნად დაისახა მოვლენებთან, ახალ გამოწვევებთან გამკლავება, საუნივერსიტეტო რეფორმა და ზოგადად განათლების სისტემის რეფორმირება ერთ-ერთი მნიშვნელოვანი ამოცანა იყო. ჩვენ ვსაუბრობთ დღევანდელი გადასახედიდან იმაზე, თუ რა მნიშვნელობის, რა გავლენის მოხდენა შეუძლია განათლების სისტემას და საუნივერსიტეტო სისტემას საზოგადოების ადაპტაბელურობაზე და იმაზე, რომ საზოგადოება სწრაფ და ასე ვთქვათ, ადეკვატურ რეაგირებას ახდენდეს იმ ცვლილებებზე, რომლებიც ჩვენს ირგვლივ, ჩვენს გარემოში მიმდინარეობს. ჩვენი საუბარი იქნება ნაწილობრივ ინგლისურად, ნაწილობრივ ქართულად, უფრო ზუსტად ვიტყოდი, რომ ჩვენ გავაგრძელებთ თითქმის სულ ინგლისურად, იმიტომ რომ ჩვენი დისკუსიის მონაწილეთა 30% გამოდის, თვალწდები, არის ინგლისურენოვანი, თუმცა ოლივერი და თიმი ჩვენი უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორები არიან და ქართულადაც ჩვენურად საუბრობენ და ესაუბრებიან თავიანთ სტუდენტებს, მაგრამ ნებისმიერ შემთხვევაში ეს ორენოვანი დისკუსია იქნება, აუდიტორიაშიც გვყავს ინგლისურენოვანი სტუმრები, ასე რომ ვეცდებით, რომ გარკვეული დასკვნები, გარკვეული შეჯამება, რომელიმე შეხედულების ქართულადაც გავაკეთოთ, მაგრამ გადავინაცვლებთ ახლა ინგლისურ ენაზე. Our English-speaking participants are already aware that we are today on the final phase of the 2 days workshop on education issues or on resilience in education. So this idea of holding the 2 days workshop at the Ilia State University was actually suggested from the University of Kent by Professor David Ayers. David is a professor of modernism and critical theory at the University University of Kent, and he's also the head of a very large research network. It's European Network for Avant-Garde and Modernism Studies. This is how we established our professional contacts, but at this point he suggested to speak and to talk about education issues and about resilience, about the role of education in creating the resilient society. That's why the topic of our workshop is cultural consequences of university reform in Georgia, building a resilient society. So what does it mean to build a resilient society, and how the university can support this process? This is the major point of our education system. I will be introducing our participants of our roundtable, so one by one. When you will be speaking, I think it's better approach. When you will be speaking, I will be making comment about your identity and background. Is it better, David, or shall I introduce it? So then let's do it right. I'm very happy that this discussion brought very distinguished people from Georgian education system here, as well as our international visitors and international guests. We have a visitor from Bochum University in Germany, and of course University of Kent, which is the organizer of this workshop. So please, let's start our discussions with the ideas about how education can help the resilient society, how education can contribute to help to the adaptation of the society to changes, because we have all experienced some drastic changes in Georgia within the last 25 or 30 years. But we all know that many other nations which were dominated by the Russian Soviet Center also experienced that kind of problems. And lots of nations today are still having a challenge to adapt to changing situations. This is the major topic for our workshop, and this will be also the major topic for the next big conference to be held at the University of, in Kent, University of Kent, in the end in June. First days of June. So I will ask David first to tell about this approach. How can you see the idea of education supporting building the resilient society, and how the University of Kent and also big British foundation, Global Challenges Research Foundation, came to this point that we have to think about education as a supporter of the resilient society.
Well, Bella, thank you for that introduction. Bella and I have known each other for a number of years, and I've long been aware of Bella's role as part of a team in the education reforms in this country. Most of our conversations have been about modernism and the avant-garde, but my own university has recently taken an interest in global challenges research. So there is in Britain a Global Challenges Research Fund. And one of the headline items in that is education and the creation of a resilient society. And I work alongside people who are currently involved in processes of education reform at university level in other countries. But in the case of Georgia, these reforms took place already beginning something like 15 years ago. So the question that I began to ask Bella was, as a consequence of the reforms, was it possible to say anything about, was it possible to evaluate what the cultural and social effects had been? And in thinking about this topic of resilient society, I was thinking in general about the model of creating a resilient civil society. But within that, as somebody with a background in the humanities, I'm very aware of the role of the humanities in recent decades, in the United States in particular, and in Europe, in providing the theoretical background for a lot of discussion about topics such as race, feminism, lesbian and gay identity, most recently transgender. And when you observe in the United States or in Britain or some other Western European countries the advance of these ethical issues, you observe that these issues, if we want to say that they are advanced, and I'll come back to that, that these kind of topics about individual and collective freedoms of one kind or another are advanced in complicated discursive spaces. Partly they inhabit the realm of universities, and partly they are conducted by people who are graduates of universities and informed by that background, but who are occupying other discursive spaces. So part of my question was whether, alongside the technical and administrative reforms in the universities, it was possible to suggest that the reformed universities were also advancing any kind of social agenda, and how universities interacted with other spaces of social discussion. I was thinking partly in terms of the model of the public sphere suggested by Habermas, and Jürgen Habermas's optimistic idea that differences can be evened out in the space of discussions at different levels of civil society. But within this question, it seemed to me that there was also another one. That in a world where American universities offer really the kind of principal example that we would all like to emulate in terms of the wealth of many of their universities and the quality of many of their universities, in terms of their global leadership position in the hard sciences, there's another question about whether and how they have adopted a leadership position in the realm of ethics and the realm of civil behavior more generally. So in other words, while we might look to emulate America, say, in medicine, and look to these universal standards that sciences such as medicine or physics and so on seem to supply, is it really the case that we would always look to the United States as our model for these ethical questions, suggesting that really the richest country is also the one that's most ethically advanced? Or on this kind of question of where social progress is, how it emerges, where are the spaces of discussion and activity that comes from, do we have to say, well, we have to respect social difference, so that if we are, supplying, if the United States or the European Union are supplying the funding, say, to improve professional training, is it nevertheless inappropriate? Is it appropriate or not to ask this question about the ethical issues that the humanities in particular is interested in? And so from my point of view, I started with this as a very open question. And I'm asking people really whether there might be ways to investigate this question further. So that's the starting point. Is that enough to say that at this point, do you think?
Since we speak about the starting point of education reform, I know that many people who are here contributed themselves to this starting point, but other people who are here are the beneficiaries of this. My colleague and professor of Ilias State University, Timothy Blavel, asked me at the starting point, as a starting point, to react about the initial reforms about education in Georgia and how the university entering exams at university admissions changed the style. But I would say that it was not only university admissions, it was also university accreditation process, as well as program accreditation, and now we call it authorization, what was that then equal to institutional accreditation. This was rising competitive atmosphere at the universities and competitiveness among the university professors. Also recognition of diplomas that Georgian universities issue, and switch to three-level education. This is BA, MA, and PhD levels in accordance accordance to European standards. And finally, of course, since 2005, when the Minister Alexander Lomaya signed the agreement with the Bologna process, that Georgia will be the part of European university integrity. Since Tim wants to reflect on these early phases, please, Tim, floor is yours. Timothy Blauvelt from Ilia State University, as well as the head of American non-governmental organization, American Councils, which runs American funded projects and programs in Georgian education. Please, Tim.
Thank you, Bella, and thank you for the invitation to participate in today's event. So, as a historian, my instinct is to lay the background and to speak about where these changes came from and how we got to where we are today. And also, as a bureaucrat who participated in some of those changes, that's most of what I would have to contribute today, I think. So, as Bella mentions, Georgia has gone through quite a lot of changes over the past 25 years. Georgia was one, how do you say this? In the corrupt system of the late Soviet period, Georgia was a place where corruption was reached particular heights, and that was quite an accomplishment in a system as corrupt as the Soviet Union. And one aspect of that, even going back into the Soviet period, was education. And Georgia is a kind of society that values sort of demonstrative accomplishment. There was a flourishing market in selling degrees in the Soviet period, and corruption in the education system was as endemic here as it was elsewhere in the Soviet system. It's also when the Soviet Union collapsed and in the 1990s, education became a particularly visible element of corruption in that period. And Georgia is one of the republics that sort of fell perhaps further than many of the other former Soviet republics, with the exception of Tajikistan, which ended up in complete civil war. For my Georgian colleagues sitting here, this is recent history, recent memory. For those of you who are younger, as they say, the past is a foreign country. The early 1990s in Georgia was a period of complete political, economic collapse. By the mid-1990s and the late 1990s, you had the restoration of an element of stability. But a stability which was recreating the sort of Soviet corruption, only funded by international sources. And education was one of the most visible of those areas of corruption, sort of one of the most obvious black holes of corruption. And in particular, the system of entrance, of how you get into how do you get into universities, something that was completely based on bribery, on corruption. The rectors of the universities were notorious. The professors involved in the accreditation program, all of the professors were making, what, $25 a month or something like that. But those involved in the admissions process all had black SUVs and lived very well. Everybody understood that this is how the system worked, that you pay large bribes to get into the most prestigious departments. You would pay large bribes even to get scholarships. So there were cases when people would pay $5,000, $10,000 to get a $2,000 scholarship because the scholarship is sort of prestigious. And there was sort of, the universities existed often not to fill educational goals, but to meet these social goals. And before the reforms began, before the Rose Revolution, there were, I don't remember the number, something more than 400 universities that existed.
No, 250 existed on paper and 160 existed in reality.
And Calbeton Bella was involved directly in the ministry side of these reforms. But there were a ridiculously large number of universities. And I remember there were larger numbers being thrown around, and some of these that existed, as Bella said, on paper. Some as they called like a Podjesny Universitet, right? That existed only as the door. And for corrupt reasons, either to get deferments for military service or to produce degrees that simply existed only on paper. There was, among civil society activists at that time, among sort of nascent opposition, among student activists, this was a really important issue, this disastrous system of corruption in the university, the absurdity of the level of corruption in the educational system. It was sort of a marker, an indicator of how far things had fallen. And among those who were interested in reform, this was an issue. And this was even an issue in in the leadership circles in the government, particularly in the Ministry of Education at that time. Like Kabatona Bella mentioned Kartozia, who was then the Minister of Education. There was this desire to do something about this, but the realization that this was so entrenched that it would be very difficult to overcome, particularly the power of the big university rectors who benefited from this corrupt system. As early as 1999, they began discussions with the World Bank, with the European Union, about how to reform, particularly the World Bank, about how to reform, especially this first portion of it, the entrance to universities. How do people get into the universities? And to create a more merit-based system of testing. And so they created what became the basis of what we now know as the National Testing Center, NIAC, which was done secretly. The original task was to develop 4th and 9th grade assessment exams. And in just several subjects, mathematics and I forget what else. But basically this was a sort of cover under which they could develop a capacity to design tests. And so this is where I came into it. So when I started with American Councils in 2003, this had already been underway for several years. We were inviting consultants from Sweden, from Israel, from the United States. We were cooperating. American Councils had the contract to provide technical assistance in cooperation with the ETS Corporation, ETS Europe in this case. We sent the Georgian specialists also on study trips to these kind of places to see how other countries handled this, but mainly, again, not to create actual university entrance exams, because that was impossible, but to create the capacity so that sometime in the future, they were thinking about maybe 2009, at that point we could at first begin to talk about introducing these kind of exams. And sort of under the rug, they were developing this capacity, because it's not as easy as it sounds, right? To make a test sounds easy, right? You just write a test and have people take it, it's easy. It's really difficult to do this, to make tests that are comprehensive, to even measure what you think you're measuring, all of the logistical aspects of how do you do this in a way that's fair and transparent. And then the other question that came up very soon is this question of the number of universities that really aren't functioning as universities, and how can you have a system of accreditation and to do that together with admission, because people understood, those who were involved in this understood very early that the question of entrance to exams is also tied to the universities themselves and the capacity of the real capacities of universities such as they were. So that was the situation before the Rose Revolution. When the Rose Revolution took place, Alexander Lomaya came in as the Minister of Education, and the picture changed radically overnight. It went from being, maybe we can develop these tests for some time 10 years from now, 5, 15, whatever amount of time from now, to being, we're going to do this.
Now.
And we're going to do this right now. The Rose Revolution happened end of 2003 into 2004. The target was now 2005. So the game absolutely changed. So how are we going to make this happen, and how is society going to react to this new system? And I can talk for a long time about the actual details about this. The decision was made, like with many other things regarding the Rose Revolution, that this is essentially a triage situation. There's like in a military hospital, right? Some patients are shot, they're blown up, they're coming in. You have to make a decision. What can we save? What can we not? This is an emergency situation. The patient is dying on the table. We need to make radical decisions. And it was decided then, under the new Rose Revolution government, under Lomaya and so forth, that the decision would be radical, that the approach would be radical. They decided to use the consultants, particularly from the Baltic states, from Lithuania, also from the consultants from Israel who had done some things in a similar way, and to take the most radical approach possible to subordinate, to take away from the universities all of the autonomy about university admissions. An absolutely radical step, to think that this is so corrupted that the universities themselves cannot have a role in this, that the test center will decide who goes to university based only on the test score to begin with. And then that the system of accreditation would be tied directly into this admission system, and that all of the state funding for scholarships and so forth would also go through this. So it was all sort of put together in this very radical sort of way. This was very controversial in society. We put a tremendous amount of resources into public relations, into making society understand what this process was, what this means, what this change is going to be, and that this is a positive thing. One of the first things that we had to do was convince the World Bank to divert money to buy cameras, thousands and thousands of cameras, so that every testing room in the country had a camera. In reality, those cameras were not very effective. You're not going to be able to see somebody cheating by looking at this sort of low pixel screen. But every mother, every parent standing outside the test buildings could see on a screen, there's their kid, there's the classroom, this is happening. It's transparency. It's a move towards transparency to show that this is open, that this is happening. Ultimately, I think this was one of the greatest successes of the Rose Revolution, of the Georgian reform. Again, it was one of the most radical. It became a model for elsewhere. The Georgian test developers who were involved in that project later became consultants for projects elsewhere, became technical specialists elsewhere in the region. Obviously, this is a necessary but not sufficient step for the reform of universities. And it's one of those things like other Rose Revolution accomplishments, reforming the police, eliminating underworld crime and so forth. That's necessary, but it's a sort of it's a very difficult thing, but it was easier than many of the other things of developing content of university, of developing the culture of assessment and all of these things. And very recently, this question has come back up again. They're discussing, can we eliminate some of the tests? Do we need all of the tests that we have? And what should be the basis for admission to university? But it brings back some of the questions, and it seems that in many ways, these are questions that many countries and universities in the world are facing, but it brings up the question, how far along have we come since 2005, when these university entrance exams were admitted? On the basis of what should university admissions be? Can we eliminate them, and what do we rely on if we eliminate them? Standardized tests are controversial for many reasons. This was controversial back in 2005 when we were arguing for this. There are many countries who are moving away from this, and yet we're moving towards it. In that emergency triage situation, the argument was very clear. It's this or disaster. Now, I think things have reached a different level, and this discussion has come up again. Can we now use, in 2019, can we base university admissions exams on things other than a standardized tests? Is the system of K through 12, especially high school grades, are those now sufficiently objective to be used as criteria? Can we use things like essays or accomplishments in other areas as part of a portfolio that universities can evaluate? Or will that, has Georgian society and has the level of Georgian education reached that level where those kinds of assessments are now considered to be objective? Or does that open the door again for these elements of corruption that were so well developed? And I think that's where we stand right now. These decisions have been taken recently in the last few months to eliminate some of the tests and to move towards other systems, yet it's not clear how objective, how realistic those kinds of changes can be.
Thank you so much, Tim, for looking back at the starting point of the reforms. But now I want to ask each participant to reflect on more theoretical as well as practical issues. So this is, on one hand, a theoretical approach, and on the other hand, if we already have a kind of practical tricks and methods how these approaches can be materialized in building a resilient society. So I will have two questions to each participant. So you can ask these questions one by one, or you can ask first question and later you can recall to the second question. So my first question is actually the main topic, major topic of our workshop. What is the role of modern university in building a resilient society? And another question will be like this: what is the role of humanities and social sciences in evaluating this role of the modern universities? So first of all, I want to hear the opinion on this of our rector, Professor Giga Zidania. You all know him, of course, but it's important to mention that Giga has a background and professional background in philosophy, as well as now he has practical experience. He's getting his practical experience and practical achievements in administering one of the modern universities in Georgia, which is based on the concept of the modern university. So please, Giga, two questions. What is the role of the modern university in building a resilient society, and what can be a role of humanities and social sciences in supporting this role?
Well, thank you very much, Bella. These are, of course, difficult questions, and part of the reason of this difficulty resides in the part of the reason of this difficulty resides in the fact that actually that they are normative questions, so they are properly philosophical. To start to tackling these questions, I would start with some descriptions, because I think that if we look at the social science and humanities in the last, let's say, 20 years or so, we can see some kind of, I don't know, in Georgia, not kind of in Georgia, we can see some kind of paradigm shift. And this has something to do also with external influence of, let's say, or influence of the West broadly defined, or the donor community, etc., etc. I mean the fact that actually if we look at the most important productions in the sphere of the social sciences, in the beginning it was definitely political science which dominated, and it dominated because it dealt with the problem of democratization of democracy, and thus attracting funding from international community, or even perhaps spurned by the funding from international community. The major question asked in the social sciences was how democratization was happening, or why it was not happening. And this was a kind of a simple sort of transition paradigm, one could say, quoting, alluding to this famous article by Karl Rotherstreit, so that people thought, well, you know, we had the authoritarian, totalitarian regime, now we'll move to democracy, and that will be it. And at some point, there was understanding that this transition wouldn't be so simple, that there could be other factors to be taken into account, say, for example, cultural factors, and the shift, there was this focused shift away from democracy to the concept of, I would say, modernity. And instead of democratization, people kind of felt more drawn to talk about modernization. So what has to change in society to create the foundation for a democratic political system? So political system was not considered apart from other spheres of society, but societal values had to be analyzed and transformed in order for the political system to function in a stable manner, so to say, to reach where there was this very favorite expression, to reach the point of non-return. So at some point you reach a stability from which you can no longer stray away, and this stability was considered to be somehow membership of NATO and membership of European Union, and then basically the democracy will develop spontaneously without any external or extra effort. So this shift in the social sciences, and also to some extent in the humanities, was to be observed, but this was definitely not the final one. So this could be what we could describe as a shift from democracy research or political science narrowly defined to a more sociological interest, and or I mean, modernization is also a very popular topic in political science as well. So what we see now is another shift, I would say, and this is a shift which basically questions the whole narrative of this, from authoritarianism to democracy, and from traditionalism to modernity, and questions the whole narrative and ask the questions about whether this concept of modernity at all is such an unproblematic question, and whether this kind of a transition or transformation is an adequate way to describe the movements and very multiverse movements existing in society. Here we see also the coming to the fore of other disciplines. Anthropology becomes, with its very kind of very narrow focus on social practices of small groups, or even interestingly enough, the law, the discipline of law, become kind of a try at least to question this broad concepts and conception of democratization and modernization, and introduce a different, mostly leftist, leftist kind of ideas which question the meta-narrative of development, and by themselves are driven by a certain meta-narrative of, let's say, neoliberalism's rise and the kind of dissociation of the social tissue and whatnot. So I think that this we can observe this double shifts, or this double shift in the sciences of society, in the social sciences, to a large extent in the humanities, and these shifts have been happening inside the university space. It's very clear that they were not limited to the space of university. There's a kind of a gray zone between the university and NGOs and media in which these concepts are tested and discussions are taking place and debates, especially now in social media, actually Facebook being one of the paradoxical incarnations of the public space as defined by Habermas, being public space, but also also not being public space to a large extent because of many reasons, and kind of as you remember, Habermas, when describing these structures of the Öffentlichkeit, the structure of the public space, also showed how it degenerated because of the rise of media. And we can also observe this degeneration, or the kind of a very worrisome symptoms with the rise of social media. But at the same time, we have to take into account that social media in Georgia were the place where these discussions were taking place. Also kind of a scholarly discussion sometimes even, or ideological at any rate. And so universities were the place where the shifts were taking place, and I think that this points to one of the major tasks of a university framework, to be a space of criticism, to be a space of testing new concepts, also to be a space where you can say, I wouldn't say everything, but almost everything, because I think that there are kind of there is this twin institutions of literature and university, which are there for a modern society to test everything, to say everything. In literature, at least, basically there is no limit to what you are allowed to say, and also in a university with its very peculiarly structured system, this tasting of new ideas should be possible, and hopefully, at least my impression is that Georgian universities, at least some of them, are doing this job better and better. So yeah, that would be my take on your questions.
Thank you so much, especially your conclusion about twin institutions like literature and university to test.
I was, of course, borrowing heavily from Derrida.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course. So we all agree with Derrida, and also we agree with you that, and it's also flattering for us to hear today that these twin institutions, literature and university, can be jointly changing the society and testing the society, because at least 3 participants of our round table, oh no, sorry, 4 participants of our round table, David Ayers as an organizer himself, Levan Tsagareli as our professor, Mirja Leges, professor from Bochum University, and myself, we are from literature. So if we insist that literature and university are both important in changing the social atmosphere and building a resilient society, then we can also say why literature scholars are addressing these issues now and today. And besides literature scholars, we have large representation of philosophy scholars here in this room and in this round table. So my next question will be to the distinguished philosopher and political analyst, Professor Gia Nodia, who himself had also an experience of leading the education system in Georgia in 2008. So both these practical and, of course, theoretical approaches are important in hearing your ideas about how the university can build a resilient society and how the humanities can contribute to understanding the role of the university.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will somehow take up more or less where Giga spoke and David, but and Bella in very beginning, but I will maybe follow my philosophical instincts in this case by questioning some concepts which were used. I will start with this public space and Habermasian, let's say, so hope that this open debate will lead to consensus. If we consider this kind of normative concept, then it's wonderful. If we consider it as kind of social science hypothesis, it has been, I think, proven wrong and based on some kind of naive enlightenment illusion that people are very rational, inherently rational, and if they are allowed to freely debate things, they will reject radical ideas and come somehow in the middle. There will be consensus, and that consensus is practically the same as truth. So we see that it's not happening, that yes, participation is increasing in public debate, but this only makes this debate more pugnacious, and actually this debate weakens the middle ground. So middle ground is losing, and the radicals are winning. Sometimes, as Giga mentioned, is blamed on social networks and these kind of things, and maybe it's true, but I don't think we can just put all the blame on this new technology. When you look on debates in parliament, for instance, you don't see much of consensus seeking, let's say so. And so where university comes in this issue, I think in a way we also saw our mission, part of our mission in creating this kind of public space for debate within university. I think that was not only about organizing, roundtables like this, but also changing the concept of teaching. In our university particular, the concept of liberal education is quite popular, and also it was used in general concept of education reform, and I am leading a special major in liberal education in this university. So the idea was that the education is not about kind of transferring knowledge, so from a head of professor, full head of professor to relatively empty head of student, but about, you know, students learning how to debate, how to and possibly come to consensus. So to create this model, which hopefully will somehow taken out of the university, and then people who develop these skills of public debate somehow transform maybe society in this image of this debate. So is it having that effect? It's hard to say, but maybe we should keep trying anyway. But that's again the problem here, that publicity of debate or transparency of debate and consensus seeking may be adversaries of each other, as we see often in also political discussions. Discussions are much better if they are closed. And as soon as media and cameras arrive, people who were talking in more or less civil way start calling each other names. So media is important. So, but then does it mean that it's public space? It should not be too public, right? Because it's media that somehow makes it really transparent and public. So that's kind of about some paradoxes. And another is the concept of resilience, and I was a little provoked by what Bella said about translating this concept into Georgian, so that she interpreted it more as adaptability to change, which is broadly saying true, but my Georgian translation would be medagoba. It's different word. So it's not just about adapting, but yes, adapting in the face of some kind of attack maybe, or that somebody tries to break you, somebody tries to maybe bend you or transform you, and you are still keeping what your identity or somehow remaining what you are. This concept, in a way, it's a catchword that came us from politicians, from some concepts of European Union levels, that kind of new security concept of European Union, introduced by Federica Mogherini's office, used this resilience very much, and then it somehow was used in many kind of projects and discussions related to European Union, which was in a way, I think, as I saw it, at least some kind of recognition that the best times for European Union are over, that this kind of soft power triumphalism is over, which European Union has, that nobody questions European Union as a model, everybody wants to join it, everybody wants to be like European Union, and now actually those institutions and values are under attack, and we should show resilience. But I think when we talk about the role of education and how to contribute to, development of society, and again I will come back to what Giga said, that we moved from this democratic transition paradigm to modernization paradigm in a way. What did it mean that democratic transition paradigm is more focused on institutional change, that we should write nice constitution and develop certain institutions, maybe use Western consultants in developing them, and then everything will be fine. But modernization, shift to modernity and modernization thinking and talking was that it's not sufficient. So just formal reforms, formal institutional reforms are not sufficient, and you need to go deeper, to dig deeper. And so in that sense, it's not that we should contribute to resilient society, but rather than society is a problem and it's too resilient. So it does not allow us to reform it, does not allow us to change it in a way. So what Bella said yesterday in her presentation about this, and what Tim also spoke about this reform, of educational admission system, etc., and which was the catchword or meta-narrative was kind of anti-corruption in a way, or replacing corruption with meritocracy. One of the concerns was that this social cultural model or social cultural aspect, that society, it's against society basically. It is against entrenched practices, societal practices. So society may prove resilient to this reform, not just only yeah, that resistant, but if it's successfully resistant, that it's sort of resilient, right? So, and I remember there were some rallies basically against these reforms, and one speaker, it was kind of famous maybe speech that Minister Lomaya, who was mentioned here, who was kind of father of the reform, he wants us to forget about institution of cousins, or Bizashilova, Deidashilova, etc. He wants to abolish institution of cousins in Georgia, because what you need cousins for, right? You need cousins, which means generally, you know, relatives and friends, to arrange, to help you, including in entry admissions, university admissions and things like that, and you arrange things through cousins. That's our Georgian way, and this minister wants to change us, so it wants us to deprive us of our social ways. And so we, and that's bad, and that I think was a very big part of resistance, right? In that sense, we have many resiliencies, so different ways of resilience. That on the one hand, universities, arena or laboratory of innovation, and introducing meritocracy into admission systems through standardized tests were considered the best tool for that, was some kind of, it was important for universities as such, but there was also kind of meta purpose that this way society in general would start believing in meritocracy, because everybody, it's not only about students, their parents and relatives, will see that you can advance in life through merit, through your skills, and not through having cousins in the right places, right? And that would somehow transform society. And I think it was fairly successful in that sense. But it also left this aftertaste that the government is really autocratic because it wants to transform society. So it's kind of Jacobin style of thinking, Jacobin modernization, as Professor Eisenstadt would have said. I think that that's very much applied to Georgian mode of modernization under previous government, that government imposes on us certain things that they learned in Western universities and tries to deprive Georgia of its true identity. And we should be resilient to this Jacobin autocratic government which tries to change us. That's one understanding of resilience, one would say. And so education reform was about overcoming resilience, this kind of resilience. But on the other hand, of course, when we come to university, and the university is based around certain ideas, certain values, which is not just about, you know, technical aspects of quality assurance and things like that, but that we represent something more. Meritocracy versus corruption and patronage networks, etc., is one of those ideas. I think it became also true about, especially about the image of our university that we represent the value of secularism versus something opposite to secularism. And this is especially part of the image of this particular university. So, and in that sense, this university should be resilient to pressures from the outside, right, to maintain this. So, what I don't want to talk too much, but there are different resiliences.
Thank you very much. We actually didn't think about that much when we started planning our workshop, that resistance can be itself seen as a kind of resilience. So that's very interesting point. Yes, sure.
Just small terminological kind of clarification, because of course, I mean, there is no point in disputing about the word. It's just, my understanding of resilience is the following, that in contradistinction to an object, human beings have the capacity that under attack not to remain the same, but to survive and change, change and survive. So basically, if, for example, we drop in my phone, and it remains as it either breaks or remains as it was. And the idea of resilience in relation to human beings and societies is that they neither break nor remain the same, but survive in a kind of developed or at least evolved different fashion. So this is kind of the understanding of resilience. And there, of course, I would say that the resistance of the conservative part of society was not about resilience, because they were saying, let us remain the same. They wanted, to use Sartre's phrase, they wanted to be the rock. They wanted to remain the rock. And the idea, of course, a modern idea of freedom and of a kind of development is that you cannot, you are not,
Yeah, okay. I agree completely, but then we go to proceed to kind of definition of what remaining means. So, and the issue of identity. So whether the change which is demanded of you is change of identity, so you start being something new. So what you maintain, you want to maintain your identity, right? While changing. So everything should change in order to everything remain the same. So I think then it becomes the issue of identity. That's exactly which was invoked by these reforms, that is this kind of change which is necessary to maintain our identity, on is this kind of change which changes our identity, and then it's something bad. So it's debate, basically, in public space, which is not always consensus-seeking zones.
No, I won't take more time.
Thank you so much. I guess we can continue these discussions for a very long time, at least, if not forever. But there is one thing I want to add to this discussion, and this is international perspective. I will be later asking Oliver about the international perspective from the point of view of European administrative institutions which support the process. But now I want to ask Miria to reflect on the debate from the international perspective of an international scholar who is visiting our university for 3 months. She is a literature scholar herself, and as we agreed that literature and education can be both supportive in developing modernized society, then it will be, of course, very important to hear the ideas of literature scholars. But I hear, let me, but first, so I'm going to change my plan, and I'm going to ask, Levan, are you leaving now, or you're, okay. Then two literature scholars will be asked now to reflect on these topics. Mirja Leke from Ruhr University Bochum and Levan Zagarelli from Ilia State University. So why literature scholars and why humanities can help to add the perspective and angle to these discussions about the role of education and university system, especially in the modern society.
Yeah, thank you, Bera. And also thank you for having me as a non-specialist that I am. And you will soon probably notice it quite clearly that I'm looking from a more practical angle at the whole situation, but nonetheless I want to express my gratitude for brushing the concept of resilience across the grain, as you say. It was really fascinating to hear that. For me, probably this is just some kind of Western common sense. I'm thinking of a liberal, secular, democratic society that is threatened by religious extremism and also by nationalism, and that needs to develop ways of educating the next generation so that we can keep a democratic, liberal, secular society, even though it may change, right? So this is my understanding of resilience, and I do think that literary scholars really do have an important role in this process. And this is exactly by training or going a piece of the path through young people's lives together with them, a couple of years, in which you offer them an environment in which they can become mature, critically thinking, reflecting, responsible, and also ethically sensitive people. And I do think that reading is one of the core competencies that can help you develop into such a person that I would like my graduates to see, and my children too, of course. What do we do in our practical work in order to reach these goals? So we teach them to read, to read closely, to analyze rhetorics, to get to the point where they can reflect on ideological manipulation and enable them to detect the intentions of the person that wrote the text that they are receiving. And I'm talking about text now, but of course, as a 20th or early 21st century scholar, this also applies to other media content. So I want my students to become aware of the way media works, of the way that facts are being produced, to find out what is valuable information and what is manipulated, to find good sources, to test them and cross-read. And all this, you know, it sounds very basic, but in a way I will remain an Enlightenment person, for that matter, forever, because I really believe in the effects of these aims in education. I was also intrigued by the question whether US ethics also have to play a key role in this. And I think that we should be very careful about this, because if we label it like US American ethics, then it's really just a tiny part of society. And we see how deeply divided American society is about these values coming from the East or West Coast elite universities with their liberal minds about sexual orientation and so on. So I think that we should, of course, read and discuss this, but I also find I spent a long time in Poland, so I really encountered the critical reception of normative US American ethics. And even though I'm inclined to think that political correctness is something that you should adhere to, I also want university to be a place where you can openly talk about the use or non-use of concepts like political correctness, multiculturalism, and so on. So I'm in favor of an open discussion of these concepts, but I by no means think that they should be just imported onto into other cultures that might end up to be just as divided as the American one is. If you look at Poland, this is clearly a threat, I think, that you have like a liberal-minded elite and a very strong nationalist counter-movement. And this is something that threatens resilience in a way. And yet another issue is the question of the free word in university. Of course, this is also problematic. We see a dramatic change in political and also scientific and historical discourse in Germany at the moment. So we see at our eyes former taboos falling, and we can see in front of our eyes that things that were unimaginable to express a couple of years ago become permissible and are even acceptable in a way. So even though, of course, university should be a model for society in being open and giving everybody a stage in the free word, we should also be very aware of the consequences that these free words might have, because this is one of the main outcomes of culturological research, that words are only, two words we have deeds follow. So I'm on the fence whether the open stage is something that has no restrictions at all. For example, the German guild discourse about the Second World War is being questioned publicly in universities, and we have right-wing student fraternities who invite people that deny the Holocaust. And this is clearly a crucial moment where we have to think how much space we should grant to the enemies of freedom. So this is perhaps a too German perspective on it, but that's mine. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now, please.
Well,
Levent Zagarelli, Professor of Literary Studies, German and Comparative Literature of Ilia State University, will continue reflecting on the role of literature in education and modernization of society. Here we invited our students from our literature classes to attend the discussion, and maybe now it will be more clear after Mirja's and Levent's comments why we hope that they will be contributors to not only their own professional development, but of the societal development in their country.
Thank you, Bella, and thank you for this question, because I also believe that literature can have a crucial role in building the new vision of the society, because if we regard literature as a means of constructing fictional worlds and modeling the reality, and if we take into consideration that literature is actually an interdiscourse embracing or capable of embracing all the existing discourses in a given society, then it, of course, is able to reflect on everything which is existing in a certain society on all levels. It might be thinking, or it might be social reality, or everything at all. So in a way that literature provides opportunity to reflect on all of the things like discourses, ideologies, and realities, you become aware of the fact that everything may have an alternative, and everything may be constructed another way. So I would argue that literature is able to produce a potential for changes. And another thing would be, in my opinion, that literature and at the same time cultural studies generally are actually, if we if we take into consideration the model of Talcott Parsons about the social systems, then we should also bear in mind that literature and culture, in an exclusive sense of this word, of course, are able to provide the orientation for the whole society. So if we think about it, then it will become evident that actually literature and culture, as well as literary and cultural studies, are able to fulfill a very important role for the other social systems and give the goal to other systems and give the values to what is done and what is not done in society, thus showing the possible alternatives of what could be aimed later, maybe. So, yes, thanks.
Thank you so much. Let me ask David Darchiashvili, professor of Ilia State University and scholar in security studies, and also a very notable politician in this country, and also the person who was leading the Soros Foundation at the stage when main educational reforms were introduced in this country, to add his perspective to our discussion, mostly from the point of view of security studies and political studies. So how do you think modern university can contribute to the establishment of more secure political and societal situation inside the country, and how this can help the country to react on to the changes happening outside, in the outside world, in the international area?
Thank you, Bella, for this wonderful discussion and being able to participate in this. I also wanted to reflect a little bit of what I've heard, although there were diverse opinions expressed, and probably it's impossible to reflect on each of them, but just generally, I would agree with Gia, as I understand it, that the term resilience is somehow a neutral term. Then it depends what should or who should be resilient, whether it's a force for good or for bad or whatever. I believe that if it comes to Giga's mobile phone, then it's better to be resilient. While if we discuss or analyze the educational system of Georgia in Soviet times, then I would not go for its resilience. It better did not have it. Although it had, and I think some remnants of it still exists, and Soviet Union collapsed, but Soviet traditions and mentalities are still probably with us, within our society, and probably Gia was worrying that if we talk about this, the resilience of these remnants, then it's not good for the general development of Georgia. Anyway, but I will return to Bella's understanding of resilience, thinking that universities, of course, should be an important agents, and there is no other way that they are important agents of development and resilience of the society, or adaptability of the society to new challenges. But let me say that one question is whether high educational institutions are important or even decisive actors in social political developments, and second, whether they are capable of really playing a role in particular space and time frames. And I would say that at the end of the Soviet Union, universities were important players and played important role. And they contributed to the development of the society and resilience in a sense of resisting to certain Soviet pressures. And we all experienced it in 80s especially, or even in the end of 70s, when Georgian language was basically protected by university students and professors and so on and so forth. But then in the 90s, when international players came, and particularly George Soros came, and let me half-jokingly say that probably small countries are doomed to be dependent not only on big countries, but also on billionaires. So we had George Soros, now we have another guy. Yes, I would not expand on that, what role is played by another guy, but so maybe it's out of scope of our discussion. But anyway, at that very moment when universities were becoming an interest of international players, and they were starting to develop schemes, projects, how to help Georgian higher educational institutions. At that very moment, maybe paradoxically, maybe because it needed time to have results of this international assistance, Georgian universities stopped either being important players or just playing any role, any positive role. That was happening in the 90s. And I mean, by the moment of this, whether Jacobinian or whatever reforms. But what we have now, I think, we have much more developed capacity of playing the role. But again, maybe paradoxically, or maybe because of the reality that universities are not in the vacuum, and they are part of the bigger network of other players, and you named them already: media, NGO community. I would add political players also. Universities stopped or somehow weakened their active participation in social political life. Why it happens so? Universities gained experience. They are better prepared to play this role, but they are not playing this role. It's not, I would say, the guilt of the universities by themselves, guilt of the faculties or students, but that's the reality. I hope it will change, and other players will pay much more attention to the position and potential of the universities. But nowadays, we see other players just filling the space on TV and in practical politics or social activity, being it the church or political parties by themselves, of course, and NGOs. But the voice of the universities is not heard very much. And I see it as a problem, as an indication that Georgian society still has to do a lot to become really resilient, liberal democracy, where universities, I believe, play a much more important role. But so it's the work ahead of us.
So it was very interesting, and also somehow not a little bit painful to hear that universities are not playing that important role in today's Georgian society. There can be many interpretations to this point, saying that maybe universities are trying to isolate themselves from the political controversy happening in the country. I think that this may be one way of explaining this topic. On the other hand, I would not say that university do not have to say much about the things, but actually I believe that they will continue on extending their role in the society and in the community when the political process is more trustful, and they can trust more their own society. So on one hand, they have to contribute into the changes in the society, and on the other hand, they have to trust the society. So I would say that this is a bilateral problem, and maybe we can continue this discussion later. But now I want to ask Oliver Reisner, professor of Ilia State University, with the experience of administering donor programs from the EU side, from the European Commission, in supporting Georgian education system and Georgian university system. So I would say that it's very important to keep in mind that there are few important roles in achieving good education system, good university system in the country. You have to establish well-operating official models, controlled by the state, and on the other hand, you have to give the freedom to the academic community, and also you have to continue putting content into university education. And I believe that this necessity of putting context and this goal of putting content cannot be achieved without international support and without internationalization of university education. I would ask Oliver to reflect on how EU was helping and is helping through its various programs to internationalize Georgian education system. And I also want to add that it was not only the EU, there were many donor organizations, especially I want to underline the importance of American donor organizations and American government, USAID, in this process. But now I would say that Europeanization and Westernization of university system is one of the topical goals of our university system. Please, Oliver, your ideas about this.
Thank you. Europeanization is a long-term process, and I would like to start shortly, really in the beginning of the 20th century, when Ilia Ivana-Javashvili tried to introduce modern concepts of university into Georgian society and nation building, when he wrote his article about patriotism and scholarship, because this was the concept of introducing modern scholarship into a society, where he was responding to Gogebashvili, Jakob Gogebashvili, about advocacy science, or can science be subdued to a good purpose. And me, as a historian, it's very important then that at the university we have to contribute to make this very important differentiation between the assessment of something that we are investigating, the Sachurteil, I don't know how you say it in Georgian, but as a philosopher, Gia, I know you might know how this is, and the value judgment, the Werturteil, because that's what makes the role of a university special in a civil society, as part of a civil society, is that it has to adhere to its specific rules of how to acknowledge and how to come to terms with the reality. Yeah? And me, being a Weberian, really that we are creating our reality by the networks of meaning. Humanities are crucial for that. Philosophy. Gia started with that, really questioning the term of resilience, which in the end was not introduced, was introduced by Mogherini from business and management, because in the neoliberal paradigm, this was already used since the 1990s to make companies more competitive. So it tells us a lot about how the transformation process in the 1990s and the early 2000s was really conceptualized under the neoliberal paradigm. Yeah? Something about how to create social cohesion in a more and more individualized societies. Yeah. And of course, with Mogherini and the EU putting this term resilience into their global strategy of foreign and security policy shows that they bought into this concept and are using this perception of reality in their policy making. European Union itself is a supranational entity. My students know, and it's not only literary studies, but also international relations students here, that how to integrate national cultures and national academic traditions. And I think this is what what the EU can really achieve with Erasmus program before Tempus and so on, really this kind of interaction by student and academic mobilities, by fostering support to international or transnational research groups and so on, building curricula together and so on. I think this is something that Georgia is actively participating, and what is also important that the European Union as a bureaucratic organization is something that is very predictable, so that existed since the Maastricht treaties, and it will be continued. Maybe the name will change in the future, and the funding after Brexit, when UK will leave the European Union, but the program will go on. Yeah? And Georgia is part of it already for 15 years almost. Yeah? So the other thing is really what I think is important, to teach at the university as a learning organization to how do we know what we know. It's not that we only have to transmit, as Gia said, something from the head of the professor to the student's head, but really reflecting on how we produce knowledge. And this is something that should be an inherent part of our curricula in all subjects, and also fostering interdisciplinary dispute among different disciplines. Yeah, yeah. I think I will stop here, but.
Since you mentioned the importance of curriculum development, I would also add that the development of the content of the university education was also supported by the EU and European organization and European project which is called Tuning Education Curriculum in Europe, harmonizing education curriculum in Europe. So when we say to our students that they have to develop their knowledge within the university atmosphere, they are asked to see their process as a competence development. So they have to develop their competences, general and subject competences, and for this, university system has to be internationalized and Europeanized. So it has to be at least comparable what your peers in European universities are introduced to by means of their general competences and general abilities, as well as subject competences. But there is one more issue I want to bring to this discussion. This is ethical issues. So philosophy scholar and vice-rector of Georgian University, Professor Tinatin Pochorishvili, will be now asked to bring this ethical perspective to this point, because she is not only the professor of the university, but she is also the person who contributed to the establishment of academic freedom atmosphere in Georgian universities. She was the first head of Shota Rustaveli National Research Foundation, which started funding research projects in Georgia on merit-based criteria. So now Tina Pochorishvili will reflect on ethical problems of academic freedom within the university environment. Please, Tina.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much, Bella, for your kind introduction. Yes, I was at the beginning of this process, which distinguished scholars were talking about, starting from 2000, or it was 2003 or 4. I was employee of American Council for International Education, and at that time I could only dream that about similar situation, because American councils through US governmental programs were funding Georgian talented students, and they were going, receiving education in the United States, and afterwards some of them were receiving diplomas and coming back and disseminating their knowledge countries. So just in around 5 or 7, less than 10 years afterwards of this program, Georgian government introduced new programs, and now you all know that there are many different programs through which Georgian students can go to different, not only to the United States, but different European countries and receive knowledge from them. So it was our, we all knew we were at the beginning of this story of reforms in Georgia, and Bella was very active, involved in those processes. So, so it was our past, but I'm very glad to see that reality is much more better. And now, when we tell stories about how we started all those reforms, students are surprised, and it seems to them that we are telling stories from many years ago, but we were involved in this process, and we are people who were back and started, one of those people who started all this process. But may I ask you some questions, because my background is philosophy. Although I was involved in educational management, still I am involved, and also science management. But my question is towards you, students: why do we need education? Is education just a tool to achieve something, or it's just final goal? Why do we need to study something? And if education is just a tool to achieve something, what are final goals? And the most important question, we are receiving education, I mean humankind or our civilization, at least 3,000 years, so on and so forth, but are we better than people who were studying just 3,000 years ago? So what's the final goal of education? Why do we need to know? Why do we need to have technical new issues? Rector was discussing new mobile phones. Why do we need all this technical progress if we are not building better society, if nothing is changing? So it seems to me that it has not, it's just education for education or just receiving knowledge. No. Actually, philosophers, and I'm pretty sure you are taught by distinguished philosophers, philosophers can tell you that society must be somehow, we cannot change or just put like performance at the stage, how to change society, but education helps to make society more, how to say, more democratic, more ethical, more better society. It's another question what we mean under better society. What is better? Because in many cases, good is something which is good for, it's subjective for one person, and for another person can think that this is not good for me. But we can, just to summarize and not to have a lecture in philosophy, just to summarize, we have to choose our priorities. What are priorities in nowadays Georgia, not only in Georgia, but in the whole world? Today's priority are STEM. What it is? Science, technology, mathematics, so on and so, hard sciences. But hard sciences, they help us to build, to increase technical progress. These hard sciences helped us. Now we can fly in the planes or have mobile phones or have this air conditioner or so on. So they help to improve our life in technical issues. But, so it's progressive, but is progress only technical? What is do we know that progress in our future lives is not only technical things, just having better life and having a better environment? I mean, technical. Of course, technical progress is very important, and much money is financially it's very important. But please don't forget that our main goal is just to build better society in terms of ethics and morality. So our final goal is just to be better people, better civilians, better students, better human beings than we were just many, many years ago. So don't forget ethical issues and humanities. Humanities is a subject and science which helps us to choose right priorities and to choose goal of our life and how to help whole society. So in this aspect, if I have just few minutes, I'll remind you, more than 200 years ago, French Academy of Sciences had competition. The main issue was, does technical progress help us to become more ethical or more moral? So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, at that time, he was not popular at all, so his answer was no. His answer was no. Technical progress doesn't help us to become moral. So from nowadays perspective, we know that there is no straight connection between technical progress and moral progress, but still, I ask you, all of them, not to forget main questions of your life. Why do we need education? Why do we need science? What are the final goals of the humankind? So universities are places where all these issues are being discussed. And in your life, you have to make choose right priorities and make decision how you decide to live. What environment you want, I mean in social, what environment do you want to live in? I mean, tyranny, despotism, or democracy, academic freedom. So this is discussion about values, and philosophers will never stop discussing these questions. So that was my small contribution to this issue. And once more, thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for a very insightful contribution about this problem. So in the end of our discussions and in the end of our long afternoon, actually, I will ask David Aviers again to summarize the discussion and to give some hope about the perspectives of humanities and social sciences in studying university reform.
Thank you, Bella, and thank you to all of the contributors to this panel over yesterday and today. I've learnt a great deal. I've been far more of an auditor, a listener, and a learner in this context than I have been the supplier of truth. That's an unfamiliar circumstance for a senior professor. You know, we prefer to dictate the discourse and everybody else listens to it politely. I've heard a great deal in these 2 days about the history of the Georgian university reforms, and I've heard especially today a good deal of theoretical discussion about what the meaning of the question regarding progress is. And this word, I'm grateful to Tina for reintroducing not only the question of ethics, which was one that I opened with, but also the question of progress. And I'm going to leave you with a simple reflection rather than attempt a complicated summary. I know that some of you are more or less familiar with this history of reform. Some of you may have been hearing it here for the first time. But I'm going to mention Marx and Engels, which senior colleagues here will know all about Marx and Engels. They'll say thank you very much. We know about that. And younger people here may know nothing about Marx and Engels. But Marx and Engels represent a particular moment in the analysis of progress. Marx and Engels are reacting in the later 19th century very strongly to Hegel, the German philosopher, the predecessor from whom they take many of their models. And part of their reaction against Hegel is to dispute his notion of progress in history and to dispute the account that he gave of what the historical progression of reason itself had been. And they disputed Hegel's claims about reason by placing technology and production at the center of their analysis of how society's progression could be measured. So the whole argument in Marx and Engels, as many of you will know, is that human freedom is to be thought of as the increasing freedom from nature. We are increasingly free from nature, they argued, by virtue of the fact that as we become wealthier, we become less immediately dependent on nature. So we are less subject to nature's power over us. So technology and production is the driver of that. They saw progress as being driven by the production of wealth. And they said the only problem that we've got now is that the social organization, the capitalist system around the organization of production is irrational and defective. So our problem is the organization of society at the level of who produces what and who has ownership of what. And that's where Marx and Engels got us. But for me, I look back a lot more, as I was mentioning briefly yesterday, to Hegel and the notion of progress that you find in Hegel. The notion of progress in Hegel has offered considerable challenges to thinkers, especially in the later half of the 20th century and in the 21st century. There have been many critiques of the model of progress that he offers. But my suggestion is that he leaves us with a set of questions that remain active and live. So Hegel, sitting at the end of the 18th century, looking back at all of the work that the 18th century had done on analyzing and documenting the progress of different societies throughout history, argued that there was indeed a discernible pattern in history. So much the way that natural scientists looked for discernible patterns in nature, Hegel thought, examined the question, and he's not the first to examine it, but he examined the question, is there an observable pattern in history? Such that historical events are not just accidents. You don't just accidentally happen to be defeated in one decade and accidentally have a military victory another. You don't accidentally have tyranny in one year and then you accidentally have democracy in another. He argued that there was a general progression of society. His model for doing that has been widely questioned. He said reason is at work behind the backs of men. You know, obviously he said men, but the backs of people. Reason is at work behind the backs of people, behind all of their individual intentions. And what reason is doing is realizing itself in history. So history is progressing somewhere. It's moving towards human freedom, was his idea. And so this notion of a universal movement of history towards freedom is, of course, extremely challenging. And as soon as, you know, among the many criticisms of it, people have said, well, if there's a universal history, how come all the bad things happen? How come different societies are culturally different from each other? Why is he saying there is this universal narrative? And all of those critiques of what he was saying and the way he was trying to say it are very hard to resist. But within that, the notion of progressing towards an open-ended sort of freedom, the notion that civilization becomes increasingly complex in its institutions and its activities and its arts and its philosophies and all of its other ramifications, the notion that increasing complexity of civilization allows for a greater and constantly more nuanced realization of individual spirit and the human spirit more generally, it seems to me is a value that we still hold to. So there are challenges modeling that, and we saw that a little bit today as we tried to discuss the concept of resilience. But I think Habermas, who we've also mentioned today, and we've mentioned criticisms of Habermas, but Habermas made the claim And I think he'd asked the right question. Is there such a thing as ethical progress? And his answer to that question was yes. My answer is, I hope so. But it seems to me in that question of ethical progress that universities can be one of the centres for thinking that, for reflecting on it, and for activating it. And it's that consideration, my consideration of those models that's been behind my questioning in this context. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have lots of topics and lots of things that we didn't manage to touch today, and I hope that these discussions will be continued in the future. And today this was just first phase of this kind of discussions on the role of humanities and literature and literature studies and social studies in the process of assessing the indirect and direct effects of university education in building the resilient society. This is the discussion that will be continued in the University of Kent, and I hope that it will be continued also at the Ilia State University in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you.